Perfect. Okay, so here's the thing, guys. There's a lot of lessons we can learn from the life and death and ministry of Jesus. There's just so much we can learn. And that's, I mean, like, as evidence of that, like, I write, I don't know, between 50 and 55 sermons a year and lessons and, on top of that and everything about that stuff. Like, my entire job is predicated on the idea that, we can learn a lot from Jesus. The fact that you guys come week after week, or you guys watch online, or whatever it is you guys do, like, that's predicated on the idea that there's a lot that we can learn from Jesus. It's not just one lesson. It's not just 2. It's not just 10. It's a lot of different lessons. And, a lot of those lessons are good and happy. If we talk about, God loving everybody, that's a good lesson. Like I don't know who in the world, like, I've never met a person who, when I tell them you are unconditionally loved exactly as you are, says, "How dare you?" Never heard that. Like, that's a good lesson. It's a happy lesson, right? And we talk about, kindness and grace and mercy. Those are like, if you said to yourself, "I'm going to live my life based on kindness and grace and mercy," I mean, your life, it's going to be awesome. Like, that, your life is going to get so much better if that's how you choose to interact with people. Forgiveness, man. Like, we all have done ridiculous things in our lives, sins, whether they're sinful, like directly, or whether they're just dumb. We've all done things in our lives that are, we need forgiveness for. We need, redemption, restoration, all of that. There's so much about Christianity that is positive and happy and good. But man, sometimes it's really important that we admit that sometimes the lessons that we learn from Jesus' life and his death and his ministry are not always so happy. And if we're Christians, we have to understand, like, we have to get to a place where we understand, that not every, it's like medicine. Like, I grew up, my dad worked for a pharmaceutical lab forever, and there was this medicine. It was pink. And I got to tell you guys, I don't know what it was, but it was like this antibiotic, and it was pink, and it was delicious. I could drink that today. Like, if you brought me just a giant vat of that today, I would just chug it. It was so good. So good. I got to tell you, though, most medicine is awful. Like, now I take these supplements, and, like, Stephanie leaves them for me on the counter, and half the time I just leave them, and I pretend I didn't see them. Like, she goes to bed, I'm like, "Oh, I'll take those." And then I'm like, "Oh, honey, I forgot." Because they taste so bad. Like, why does it have to taste like that? So, I mean, like, there's some medicine that's good and some medicine that's bad. And as Christians, we have to be willing to embrace the medicine that's not so good. So this morning is a not so good one. And I just got to tell you, that was a whole preface to it's not so good. This morning's lesson, the spiritual lesson from Jesus, is this: people are really dumb. That's the lesson. If you walk away with nothing else today, I need you to hear that. People are so dumb. And here's a good example of that. The whole reason Jesus died was because people were dumb. And I don't mean, like, we spend a lot of time talking about, like, God's will and God's plans and all that, but we're not talking about that. I mean, like, the physical mechanism that kills Jesus just shows how stupid people are. Okay, so this is the situation. 2,000 years ago or so, a little more than that, Rome invades Israel. And they take over, and they conquer the people. And Israel becomes, part of the Roman Empire against their will. They get taxed against their will. They have troops wandering the streets against their will. They have, governors against their will. The Caesar is their lord against their will. It is tyranny. It is fascism. You pick your noun, and that's what it was. And so it was just, that was the life they lived. And the people of Israel, if nothing else, they were stubborn. They were stubborn people. They did not enjoy it, and they were not going to take it lying down. And for the better part of 100 years, the people of Israel fought back. I mean, not like in any official way, but like they would be like, to the Romans, they would call it little acts of terror. Insurrection. To the Jews, it was just people standing up for themselves. But they were these little skirmishes. There were battles. There were fights. There were Jewish people killing Romans and Romans killing Jewish people, and that kind of stuff happened over and over. We have a hard time sometimes, I think, imagining the Gospels because we imagine them in a world like it's our world, but that's not it at all. Like, their world was filled with violence and bloodshed. And Rome loved to talk about the peace of Rome, but the peace of Rome was predicated on Rome, subjugating people, which is not peace, right? It was the sort of peace that violence brings, which is not peace. And so that's the world. Jesus is born smack dab in the middle of that. He's born into a world where everyone is always fighting. And that leads us to the religious leaders. The religious leaders, we know, are the ones who wanted Jesus dead. And the reason they wanted Jesus dead was because of what we just talked about. For 3 years, the religious leaders didn't like Jesus. They argued with him. They tried to get him to stop. They tried to discredit him in public. They did all of the things we read about in the Gospels. But they don't try to kill him until, or at least in an organized fashion. They don't get together as a council and sit down and formulate a plan and actually execute Jesus until Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. That miracle, that very public miracle, is what really kind of pushed things over the edge. Because you see, the religious leaders of Israel saw themselves with a very specific role. Have y'all ever made mashed potatoes and you got to boil the potatoes? And then you're boiling the potatoes, and then it gets a little too hot, and it boils over, right? So you know what you do when you have that situation? You put a wooden spoon over the pot. I don't know if anybody else does this, but and here's the deal. I don't know if it's magic. I don't know if there's some sort of science behind it. I don't know if Tom Cruise's Scientology somewhere is just out here doing its thing. I have no idea, but it works. So the religious leaders of Israel, they see Israel as the boiling pot, and it's just ready to bubble over. And they saw themselves as the wooden spoon holding everything in. They felt that they were the ones holding everything together because they were sort of the go-between between Rome and the people of Israel. And they were always on the lookout for things that might lead things to boil over. And as soon as Jesus raises a guy from the dead publicly, they realize this is a problem. In their heads, the only logical thing that could happen is all of these people who are already fighting, all of these people, and again, for 100 years, people have been fighting. All these people who already want to get rid of Rome, they said there's no way those people will now not gravitate to Jesus, because if you can raise the dead, well, you have an unbeatable army. What are you going to do? Kill the whole army? Well, Jesus brings them all back. I mean, it's an unbeatable situation. And they realized Jesus is dangerous. And Jesus is going to bring people to a place where there's revolution. And they didn't think that Jesus was actually going to be able to win. So they thought in their heads, this is what they thought. They thought if Jesus, they didn't get rid of Jesus, right? If they didn't get rid of Jesus, then people would follow Jesus. There would be a revolution and Rome would come in and destroy the nation. So it's kind of like this, if you're making mashed potatoes, you got the wooden spoon. It doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes you got to take a little water out, and then it'll work. So they thought Jesus was that water. You just got to take it out. You got to take Jesus out. And so they arrested him, and they turned him over to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and they wanted him dead. And that's when their idiocy was shown. That conversation, this exchange between Jesus and Pilate shows how dumb the religious leaders were. Because Jesus sits down. He's been arrested. At this point, he's been abused already. It's a terrible thing. And he sits down with Pontius Pilate, and they start to talking, and Jesus makes it very clear. Hey, look, man, I'm not fighting. You've never heard me fight. You've never heard my followers fight. He said, man, if I were a threat to Rome, if I was a threat to your power, the thousands of people I would help would be at your doorstep right now. But they're not. I'm not a threat to you. I will never be a threat to you. That's not what I'm here for. Jesus tells Pilate immediately, it's not it. What the religious leaders thought was going to happen was never going to happen. And Pilate believed him. Pilate, to his credit, recognizes that Jesus was never a threat at all. He declares him not guilty. He tries to free him. And it's only when he literally washes his hands of the situation and the Jews literally say, fine, we'll take responsibility, that Jesus is even killed. But here's what we need to understand. Jesus was killed because people thought that he was going to start a revolution and cause the downfall of Israel. And not only was Jesus never going to do that, ever, they were wrong. But Rome does not pick fights for no reason, because if nothing else, wars are expensive. And all Rome wants is the money from their subjugated people. We talked about this a few weeks ago. They didn't tax their own citizens. They taxed the people they conquered, right? They don't want to fight. They want cash. And a fight is negative on the ledger, you know? Jesus was never going to pick a fight, and Rome was never going to invade, ever. The religious leaders were dumb. And if that's not enough, hilariously, ironically, it's not that funny, actually, because, people died. But, ironically enough, 35 years after these events, Jesus gets killed. 35 years later, the religious leaders oversee a situation where, wouldn't you know it, some folks get together and they revolt against Rome, and Rome comes in and destroys the nation. Exactly what they feared would happen with Jesus happened without Jesus. What they thought would happen when Jesus was here happened when Jesus was gone. And I'll give you, this bit of information. Had Jesus been there, I'll bet you $1, he'd have helped make peace. They killed the one dude who could actually bring peace with people. In an attempt to keep peace, they killed the one guy who could bring peace. That is dumb. That's the dumbest thing. It's just ignorant. It's ridiculous. That is the worst judgment in the world. It's the worst judgment of character. It is the worst prediction. It is dumb. And I don't want to be too hard on the religious leaders. Pilate wasn't that much smarter. Yeah, Pilate sees Jesus innocent, but Jesus also tries to have a spiritual conversation with him. Something that could bring actual peace. Not the peace of Rome that's predicated in violence, but a peace that comes from God. Jesus tries to give that to Pilate, and Pilate's like, no, I can't talk to you about that. Pilate was dumb too. They were all dumb. The whole thing was dumb. All right, fine. I don't want to give him too much grief either, because, look, here's why this is important. The religious leaders of Israel were the cream of the crop. They were the smartest people. This is a world that's 5% literacy. All the religious leaders were that 5%. They were able to read. These are people who had access to knowledge. They had access to wisdom. They had access to everything, right? This is the cream of the crop. These are the smartest people. Which is a fancy way of saying, if you were to take me in a time machine and go back then, these people are smarter than me. And if you were to jump in a time machine and go back, these people are in all likelihood smarter than you. And they were really dumb. This is the bitter pill to swallow. The smartest people were so dumb they killed Jesus for the most ridiculous reason. And we're not smarter than them. If I'd have been back then, I'd have done the same thing. If you'd have been back then, you'd have done the same thing. This is just who we are as people. It's the bitter pill that I don't want to take. People are dumb. We think we're smart. It's easy to surround yourself with idiots and think, well, I'm smarter than that guy. We're all pretty dumb. Our judgment is lacking. This is maybe a nicer way of putting it. But it just means the same thing. This is why we make terrible decisions. This is why, despite our best efforts, things blow up in our face. We're dumb. And that principle is at the core of one of Jesus's core teachings. Without understanding that fact, we are never going to understand why Jesus teaches the way he teaches. Because Jesus understood who people were, and he was teaching us based not on what he wished we would be, but on what he knew we were. And that leads us to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' most famous sermon is his most fundamental teaching. Right at the end of that, maybe the most famous part of that sermon is this, which we read in Matthew chapter 7. Jesus says, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. For you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Now, this passage, I don't want to, like, we need to think through this, okay? When I was in high school, it seemed like every dude I knew who had tattoos had the "only God can judge me" tattoo across his chest. It was always right here. Only God can judge me. That's not what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is not saying, like, only God can judge. That's not it. Like, it's not 1998. It's not middle of Indiana, okay? It's not what this is. But what Jesus is saying is something very real about our judgment. So a few things he says. He says, do not judge. But what he means by do not judge is be exceedingly careful in the way that you judge, right? Because he starts by saying you will be treated as you treat others. You will be judged. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. What Jesus is saying is that we set the terms with God for the way that God will treat us. We set the terms. The sorts of people we are will come back to us. That's first of all. Second of all, he says we should absolutely judge ourselves. Absolutely. He gives this illustration that's super funny. It's actually like it's this really outlandish, like over the top crazy illustration. He's talking about like if somebody's got like something in their eye, like a speck of sawdust, they got something in their eye. We always want to do that, right? He compares what's in another person's eye with what's in our eye. And he says what's in somebody else's eye is like a speck. It's like a piece of sawdust, right? Like just a little bit, like the little eye gunk you wake up with in the morning. That's all it is. But what's in your eye is this giant log coming out to here. This big old 2x4. You've got a plank of wood coming out of your eye, and other people have sawdust coming out of theirs. Now, what's interesting about this illustration is whoever it is that's listening, it flips, right? So if I'm talking to Jeff, all right, if we're talking about me and Jeff, the way Jesus understands that, to me, I've got a log in my eye, and from my perspective, Jeff's got a piece of sawdust in his. But if Jeff is the one listening, he's the one with the log in his eye, and I'm the one with the speck in mine. Is it not a fixed thing? It's a relative situation. And what Jesus is getting at is this. What's wrong with us, our flaws and warts and sins, our mistakes, our dumbness, that is so much more a problem in our lives than anyone else's. We are the ones who hurt ourselves. We are the ones who bring ourselves down. It is our attitude. It is our beliefs. It is our perspective. It is our actions. We hurt ourselves almost always. We are the ones who hurt ourselves far more than somebody else. And so when we go to try to help somebody, which, oh, by the way, we should do, Jesus doesn't say, oh, don't help the other guy. But he says, worry about yourself first. Worry about yourself as you help somebody else, and understand that somebody else's problem is so much less a problem to you than your problems are. See, it's a matter of the way that we judge. We would never see it that way. We would see it like I got a little speck and Jeff's got this giant log. That's the way we look at it usually. Jesus flipping that. He said, we want to attack other people and say, well, it's their problem. What about those guys? Somebody tells us what's wrong in our life. Well, what about that? Jesus is saying, get rid of that, right? Be willing, be humble enough to look at your own life and understand that you are the problem. And you are the solution. What Jesus teaches. This idea of judgment. When he says do not judge, what he's getting at is don't be the sorts of people who judge other people without looking at yourself. Don't be the sorts of people who believe yourself to be greater than someone else. Don't be the sorts of people who think that you are somehow special, or your ideology is somehow special, or your beliefs are somehow special, or your family is somehow special, or your race is somehow special, or your politics are somehow special. You're not special. And your problems are what's making you miserable. All of this is predicated on the idea that we're dumb. I get the impression that if we were better judges of character, Jesus just would have said, yeah, judge all you want. Like if we were good at this, Like if we were able to properly, see and prioritize and evaluate the way life works, if we were able to actually do that, yeah, judge away, have at it. But because we're so terrible at this, because at the end of the day, when we stand in judgment of other people, when we evaluate the world the way that we always do it, we always put other people as worse than ourselves. Because of that, don't judge. Because you're terrible at it. You're terrible. So don't. Instead, be careful. Be humble. Worry about yourself. Now, like I said, this is the core of Jesus' teaching. This is ground floor stuff, right? This is absolute, this is vital. And so it shouldn't surprise us much. Well, it shouldn't. We'll get to where it should. But it shouldn't surprise us that much that when James, the bishop of the church at Jerusalem, when he writes a letter to the ancient church, he doubles and triples down on what Jesus has to say. We've been talking for the last couple months now that James is this bridge between old people and new people. The church is comprised of people who knew Jesus during his ministry, the old guard, the old crew. And then there's the new people who come along later, like Jesus is risen from the dead, and now people believe, and now there's these new people. And James operates as a bridge between the two, right? Because he knew Jesus but wasn't a disciple. He was old, but he didn't believe. And now he's a convert, but he was there the whole time, So he's got one foot in one place and one foot in another place. He's not really in either group, but he can relate to both groups. So he's that bridge between the two people, the two groups of people, I should say. When James writes a letter to everybody, he doubles and triples down on what Jesus has to say about judgment. This is what James says in the second chapter of his letter. He says, so whatever you say or whatever you do, remember that you will be judged by the law that sets you free. There will be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others. But if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges you. He just explains that passage, that first part of Jesus' sentence on the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, by the standard you judge, you'll be judged. And that's what James just says. He just doubles down on the point. And then this is what he says in the fourth chapter of his letter to the church. He says, don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you are criticizing and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not to judge whether it applies to you. God alone who gave the law is the judge. He alone has the power to save or destroy. So what right do you have to judge your neighbor? Again, he's just expanding on this idea of do not judge. James, writing about 30 years after Jesus teaches, emphasizes, reiterates, and again, doubles down on what Jesus had to say. And given that this is such a core teaching of Jesus, it makes sense that he would emphasize this. It makes sense that he would come back to it. It makes sense that he would say, hey guys, this is really important stuff. Make sure you do this. But also, doesn't it kind of not make a lot of sense? Like, if you think about it, like, why does James have to repeat Jesus? Like, why does James have to say, hey, remember that stuff Jesus said? That stuff still applies. Why would the people not have understood that? Now, I grant that maybe some of the new people didn't know. It's really hard to know with the Bible, when stuff is written, who has what when. It's possible that the older or the newer audience maybe hadn't heard the Sermon on the Mount. It's possible. But that leaves us with the old guard, the people who knew Jesus from the start. This is what we know about the Sermon on the Mount. We know that Jesus not only preached it, but that he preached it repeatedly. That makes sense, right? There's no recordings of anything, right? Like, it's not like you just post your sermon online. You can't even give an 8-track of it, or a tape deck. None of that exists. So if Jesus is going from town to town, audience to audience, with each new town he goes to, with each new audience, it's all new. It's all new. So we know that Jesus doesn't write a new sermon every time he goes to a place. He just repeats the same stuff. And of course, he's gonna to cater it to the audience. He's gonna, sometimes, he has a point to make with these guys, and sometimes, okay. But we know that the Sermon on the Mount specifically is something he preaches repeatedly over and over and over, which means there's a 100% chance that the folks who knew Jesus before had heard this. Don't judge is not new at all. And yet 30 years after Jesus says it over and over again, town to town, audience to audience, James feels compelled to not only say it, but to say it twice. Why? There's two answers to this. The first one is what we've been saying all along. People are dumb. I mean, we so often have to learn the same lesson over and over again. And particularly when it comes to judging. I'm just going to say it. I'm going to say it out loud. We're all thinking it. There is nothing more fun than judging people. It is the best. It is intoxicating. I know some of you guys are like, yeah, the best feeling in the world is your child smiling at you. The best feeling in the world is your wedding day and your beautiful bride walks down the aisle. No, the best feeling in the world is somebody you don't like when you find something wrong with them that you can hammer in your head or with your friends. It's the best feeling in the world. And we know we shouldn't. But there's a lot of things in life that feel great that we shouldn't. Judging is poison for our souls. When we judge others, we lose complete sight of who God is, who people are, who we are. But we love to do it because it feels just swell. People are dumb. And that's part of it. But I also think that part of it, based on something else that James says, has very little to do with our personal relationships and everything to do with what the church's function is. Here's what I mean. This is what we read in James chapter 5. He says, "Are any of you suffering hardships? You should pray. Are any of you happy? You should sing praises. Are any of you sick? You should call for the elders of the church to come and pray over you, anointing you with oil in the name of the Lord. For a prayer offered in faith will heal the sick, and the Lord will make you well. And if you have committed any sins, you will be forgiven. Confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you might be healed. The earnest prayer of a righteous person has great power and produces wonderful results." James is talking about the function of the church. And as he describes the function of the church, he describes it as a place that is available for people to come and have their needs met. And those needs might be different, right? Those needs might be different. The first one, are any of you suffering hardships? That is fundamentally different than the second thing. Are any of you happy? You're like, those are two entirely different situations. Those are two entirely different things, right? Like, if you're suffering hardship, then, you should come to church. If you are happy about stuff, you could come to church. Period. End of discussion. Same place for both people. Then he says, if you're sick, you should come to church. If you're looking for forgiveness of sin, you should come to church. The solution is for everybody. And so in James' eyes, in James' perspective, what the church is a place where people come exactly as they are, and they find support, and they find love, and they find people to help. And it doesn't matter the circumstance. What matters is the church is available and people can come. But see, here's the problem. If the church is a place where everyone can come no matter what, well, that means the church has to be a place where people are comfortable coming no matter what. And if every time people come through the doors and they're open and they're honest and they're transparent, we judge them, well, then the function of the church goes away. If every time somebody says, look, I've committed sin and I need to confess and I need help, and we come and do that, and then we judge them for that sin, they're never coming back. The church loses function. Or to put it another way, if every time somebody comes through the church and they've got questions or doubts or problems, they say, I don't know if I believe all this stuff. And we say, well, you need to leave then. Well, then they will. The church is meant to be a place where everyone, just as they are, can be honest and transparent. The church is supposed to be a place where you can be yourself more than anywhere else. There are all sorts of situations and all sorts of circumstances and all sorts of places in this world where you are not allowed to be yourself. The church is supposed to be place number one where you can be yourself and find love and support. And that doesn't mean we approve of everything. Of course it doesn't, because part of love and support is helping people to confess and repent and find a better path forward. Of course it does. But if we do that with judgment, we're just going to leave. I dare say that in our culture, the church has lost influence. And the loss of influence, side by side, if we had graphs, it's lockstep with the church being judgy of everybody. If the church is not a place where everybody can feel welcome to come, well, then everyone won't come. It's just that simple. And the purpose of the church is where people can be themselves. They can ask questions. They can say what they believe. They can sit wherever they sit and know that God loves them, God is for them, and wherever they are, it's okay. And we love you, and we're going to help you take whatever next steps you need to take. And if you're not ready for that yet, okay. When you are, we'll be here. You can hang out anyway. The church is supposed to be a place where there is no judgment. It's a core teaching of the one we say is God. We're the ones that say that. Our belief is that Jesus is God. Well, God has told us not to judge. And at the end of the day, the church does not function as a church. It ceases to function as a church when we are people of judgment. And so we've got to understand that we are dumb. We are terrible judges of character. We are the worst kinds of judges. So we should be very careful. We should worry about ourselves. We should do that as we help other people. We should recognize that other people are not worse than us. The problems that are in our lives come from us, not them. And we should always understand that the measure that we want, the measure we offer, is the measure that we get. Everyone sitting in this room wants to be able to be open and honest. None of you want to come to church and fake it. And if that's what you want, well, that's what everyone else should get too. It doesn't matter if they all believe the right thing. It doesn't matter how they sin or what they do or if you agree with who they are. What matters is that God loves us all, and the church is a place where we can come. And so long as the church is a place of judgment, the church is not the church Jesus wants. This morning, we're in our 6th week of our series called The Bridge. Almost done. Next week, we're done. Next week's the last one. I just like to throw that out there. Next week's the last one. Almost our final one. I was talking about this judgment thing. James repeating this thing Jesus said. He shouldn't have had to, but he does, because we are so bad at judging. So we should just stop. Understand it's not our thing. And this morning we are in our 6th week of this series. And as we talk about James, we talk about judging, we talk about all this stuff. This is our 6th lesson. 6th lesson from the bridge is this: Christ made the church to love and support all people at all times. And it does when we don't judge. Christ made the church to love and support all people at all times. And it does when we don't judge. We're going to come forward. The musician's going to come forward. We're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week. Take God up his offer. Here's the deal, guys. I don't know what you believe. I don't know where you're at. And I can't. The hard thing about a sermon like this, if I can get this is not the sermon, this is me talking. The hard thing is we all know this. Nobody in this room is yeah, I should judge people. Nobody says that. But we do. And so this is one of those places we've just got to get to a place in our lives where we say, this is my goal. And when we do that, we can be honest and transparent and open, and we can actually grow. Growth never comes from censoring who we are, ever. Growth always comes from being open and willing to grow. And so as a church, that's what we're going to try to do. And we're going to fail at it because, like I said, judging is super fun. But we're darn sure going to try. And so we're not a perfect church. We do serve a perfect God. If you've never been baptized, you don't know what that means, let's talk. If you want to join the church or whatever, let's talk. But at the end of the day, we follow a God who knows exactly who we are and loves us anyway. And he knows exactly who they are, no matter who they are, and loves them anyway. Our job is just to get out of the way and help people come to Jesus and let Jesus do his job. As we stand,